Welcome back to Shattering Myths. I'm having a conversation with Daniel about whether or not it's prudent to try to debate a Christian pastor on the errors of the Christian religion. And, Daniel, there's so many different tactics you can take. You can begin by saying, what's the Savior's name? And you'll say Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
So you're saying that Jesus is his first name, Christ is his second, his last name. Is that what you're saying? Then why is it possible? How is it possible that since he had a Hebrew name and there is no J in the Hebrew language, not even a J in the Greek language, that he could be named Jesus, and that the sus ending is to comply with Greek grammar rules to make the name masculine? Yah should be feminine in Greek. Are you aware, dear pastor, that the name Ayushu, Ayusun, Ayusu is not written out even one time in any of the 69 extant manuscripts that predate the establishment of the Christian religion by Constantine? Not once in those 69 documents do you find the name even written out. It's a placeholder. Do you know what the placeholder represents? Do you know where it comes from? And if you can't get his name right, dear pastor,
Right.
how in the world do you have a religion based upon a fellow you can't even get his name right? And if you don't know his name, I'm going to tell you, you don't know him.
Yeah.
And dear pastor, you're going to be celebrating. Yeah, you're going to be celebrating Easter.
Mm-hmm.
You know that it's a pagan.
Actually.
It's a pagan holiday. Why are you going to encourage those that trust you to celebrate a pagan holiday?
Yeah. Well, let me tell you what's even more dangerous about what he does. And if I can cut you off, I'm sorry to do that.
Sure,
but,
that's okay.
He every other year he does. I guess I should say he plays Passover. So he invites the church, and they go through all the rabbinic stuff and how it relates to their character, and which that freaks me out with what you say about celebrating that leads to immortality. And if that's the case, then that's a very, very scary to think about my mom in that position, and my dad. But my dad can make his own decisions pretty much, and So
and in fact, go right down that path to say, that there is nothing you could do more harmful to those who trust you than to celebrate Passover without following it with a celebration of matzah and bakurim.
They have leavened bread there at the thing.
Oh, God, they even have leavened bread in the celebration of Passover?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And my goodness.
Yeah. I've been to it twice because I was interested to see how it goes. So I went. That's the only two times I've walked into their building.
Good.
But
Passover is the first day of unleavened bread. And it's not unleavened, it's really unyeasted bread, because yeast is the fungus that corrupts the loaf. And the issue is, first of all, Yahowah makes it very clear there are prerequisites for attending Passover. For example, if you do not bear as a man the sign of the covenant and aren't circumcised, he says, don't do it. And the reason he says don't do it is because it's the worst of all possible circumstances, which is what you've alluded to. If somebody were to observe Passover properly and yet not observe and meet with God the following day on matzah, unyeasted bread, then their soul is immortal but forever estranged from God. That's the worst possible circumstance. That means that any soul who would observe Passover and not observe unyeasted bread, as evidenced by their matzah during their yeasted bread during their Passover celebration, and the fact they didn't celebrate unyeasted bread, every soul that followed his advice in that regard would be destined to Sheol. And that's a horrible fate compared to simply ceasing to exist upon their demise.
Now, say there's that slim. I'm sorry.
Right. Oh, yeah, I was going to say the other thing about Passover. Yeah, on Passover, of course, you should ask him. What happens to the remains of the Passover lamb following that night, following the celebration of Passover? And he probably won't know. But read it from the Torah. It says it must be incinerated. So now if you recognize that Yosha's body, because he was Torah observant, was incinerated that night, now you understand why on the Bakurim 2 days later, no one recognized him because he had an entirely different body. His appearance now was entirely different because his old body was gone. That's why no one recognized him. Now, think about these things.
Yeah, I know. I'm only going to have so much time, so I'm going to start with the creator's name and then his son's name and work my way through from that point and see where it goes. But say my mom does, start to think, and I know it's a very, very slim chance, but if she does, then she can come back from that, correct? I mean, the whole...
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And the key thing here is that, well, I would discourage you from taking the approach with your pastor because he's not going to be receptive. He's going to have a conniption fit. Now, I experienced something different with Jerry Falwell, but I didn't bring a believer with me. And in front of Jerry Falwell and the head of his Hebrew Studies department at Liberty University, when I knew 1/1,000,000th of what I know today, I presented the errors between Yahowah's testimony and Christianity, the conflict between them. And when I got through, after about 4 hours, he said, "Everything you've said is true. There's not a single point that I could argue with." So he admitted it was all true, but then said, if I were to say these things, there would be no one sitting in the pews of my church. The envelopes that are filled with checks that support my university would stop arriving in the mail. And if you say these things, you'll be labeled a kook. So he went on with the lie, knowing it was a lie. Now, I don't know if the Calvary church pastor is that well informed, but my suggestion, Daniel, is that tell your mother that when she is receptive, you will gladly share Yahowah's truth with her, and you will tell her exactly what God is like, what He's offering, what He wants her to know, and how she can capitalize on this family relationship that God is offering. At any time that she would like to have that discussion, you are prepared and eager to have it with her. Yeah. And I think you'd have you do have an opportunity with your mother. You just don't have one with the pastor.
Right. I was going to ask him if I could actually record the conversation just to, so I can go back but he might say no to that. We'll see.
Yeah, that would be fun. Yeah, that would be fun.
I would like to do that, though.
Yeah, it'd be fun. Yeah, exactly. That would be fun. All right, Daniel, thank you.
Like I said, I don't want to take up all your time, but thank you for talking to me, and I hope to be an active participant coming up.
Yeah, please do so, and after this meeting, please call in again, or if you'd like to discuss various ways to handle this discussion between now and then. We'd love to hear from you again. All right, with that, we've got Glenn on the line, and Glenn, you called in the midst of that discussion with Daniel, so my guess is that there's an aspect of it that you would like to share your insights regarding.
Well, I could. Actually, the reason I called is I was listening to the news on the break.
Oh, okay.
And I heard this story about the human rights group that assessed the number of people who've died during the Syrian conflict in the past 3 years, and it was over 150,000. It's like, did anybody just take note of the fact that there were 50,000 people? It's like, anybody care about that?
Glenn, in that regard, first, I don't think that number is right. I think the number who have been killed is no, I actually think it's the other way. I think the number who have been killed is significantly larger than that. I think that ultimately the number that are going to be killed, though, are going to be in the millions in this war. So I think it is just the tip of the iceberg. My guess is that the actual number who have been killed is probably closer to 200,000. There are, in the number that they're saying killed, 150,000, there are at least 50,000 that are missing. And the missing, when you are missing and are being held by those as vicious as either the Assad regime or those opposing him, you typically don't live very long. The missing are never returned to their families. So I think it's actually 200,000. But as I study Yahowah 17 and read what God has to say about Damascus and the fall of the Syrian government and the roaming hordes of animals who finally have no one left to kill, I think that the death toll is going to be in the millions. The real question to me, Glenn, on Syria, and I haven't really wrapped my head around this yet, but in the Syrian war, it's really all but over. Assad won. The rebels hold only desert territory along the Iraqi border. The last stronghold in terms of a meaningful metropolitan place is Aleppo, and there really is no significant even resistance left in Aleppo. So Assad won. He has won every battle since Hezbollah engaged a little over a year ago, and so the question is, how does the war continue on under these circumstances? Because God tells us that Syria, the government, ultimately loses, and Damascus is turned to a heap of twisted rubble. So one of two things is going to occur. One is that the United States has secretly, and it's now been found out, that Obama several months ago gave a secret order to the CIA to provide advanced weapons to the Sunnis. These include anti-tank weapons, access to tanks themselves, surface-to-air missiles, anti-aircraft guns, rocket-propelled grenades, a number of weapons that are vastly more sophisticated than what they were previously using. And Obama just met with Saudi Arabia and has promised even more American military support of the rebels, so that perhaps America can increases dramatically the weaponry that it brings to bear in this conflict, which is all but over if America doesn't do that. Or second, that this is not the first proxy war fought in Syria. That you go back to the Homs destruction in Syria, where Bashar al-Assad's father killed 40,000 people in a week in Homs, was in direct response to the first of these proxy wars. And so this could be one of several proxy wars, and this one may end only to flare up again sometime in the next 5 to 10 years. So kind of interesting to noodle what is going to happen along the timeline. Welcome back to Shattering Myths. We're talking about Syria with Glenn. And Glenn, your point is valid. Most news agencies have reported that 100,000 people had been killed in Syria. Some had increased the number to 120 to 130,000, and then you have this announcement that it may be closer to 150,000. And that's a lot of people to have died in a proxy war. But the issue with this war is what happens. If Obama wasn't such a menace, I would assume that this war would wind down. Assad won. The Sunni jihadists will have failed. Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the other states, the United States, that sought to turn this into be a civil war, will have failed. But Obama is a genuine menace. I mean, he is trying to create war with Russia, either by bombing Damascus or by belittling Russia over Crimea and the Ukraine. Crimea River Obama. He's just so obnoxious. He's similarly obnoxious with China. I mean, the guy is really trying to move the world into war, and so I'm really concerned.
On behalf of the international community,
Oh, of
They
course.
always invoke this like, oh, we are we're going to spank you and scold you in the name of the international community because that's who we represent.
Yeah, it's who he represents. And the only problem with that is that a national leader ought to represent the interests of that nation, full stop.
Mm-hmm. Right.
The world did not elect Obama savior. It didn't. And so he ought to only be concerned about and speak for the interests of the American people. And this notion that he is advancing international interests in belittling Assad and meddling in Syrian affairs by providing weaponry to those who are opposed to him, most of whom aren't even Syrian, by making demands in Afghanistan about demanding how our troops are to stay there and be judged by American laws, his constant belittling of China hypocritically, while he's demanding that no American company buy Huawei electronics, when in fact it's America that's spying on them versus the other way around. There is nothing more hypocritical than his stance on the Ukraine. I mean, I don't want the Ukraine. I have no interest in the Ukraine. America has no interest in the Ukraine. Why in the world this guy, on behalf of what he thinks is the international interest, would be belittling Russia so that the Ukraine can become a dependency of the United States? I don't get. He's dangerous.
Right. It's almost, if you thought of the world as like a neighborhood, if you pictured a bunch of people living in modest houses, like these would be, most of the countries of the world, and there being a couple really huge houses of wealthy and powerful people in the neighborhood, the attitude seems to be like that the wealthy and powerful people who live in the wealthy and powerful homes have to be sticking their noses into everybody else's house. The people in the middle, you know what I mean? I don't see. Can't we let Bolivia handle an international crisis once in a while? Maybe Switzerland. Can't somebody? I don't know. Somebody else can field one of these things. No. It's always incumbent. Somehow we think that we have the right and the duty to be sticking our nose into everybody else's business in the world.
Oh well, look at this. The big news is that Caterpillar is being accused by Senator John McClown of skirting taxes. Now, why would Caterpillar, that's an American manufacturer, but they do business around the world, why would they want to avoid U.S. taxes? Perhaps because it's the highest corporate tax rate in the world? Because the United States government wants to control every aspect of what they do. They make them pay a tax toll for the retirement of their employees, make them pay a tax toll for the health care of their employees, making them pay all sorts of penalties to the U.S. government to penalize their success. And then we're surprised when they say, we're going to take our business elsewhere.
Well, and yet select patrons like GE are off the hook.
Oh, it's amazing that General Motors, here the U.S. government decides that it's going to be the enforcer of moral values, and it's going to fine for the sake of its own treasury Toyota over $1 billion, and that the auto company that it owns, that it bankrupts so that it could own, is creating and perpetrating almost the most devious and deadly just cover-up ever known to the automobile industry. Pure hypocrisy. Welcome back to Shattering Myths. We have Glenn on the line. Glenn, I'd like to consider what NATO has said about the Ukraine. You realize that the whole argument that Russia has is that, I don't think Russia gives two hoots as to whether the Ukraine borrows money from the International Monetary Fund or from it, nor what kind of government they elect in the Ukraine, so long as they're not abusive to Russians, so long as they pay their bills because they're dependent on Russian gas, which the Russians just raised the price by 50%. Then I don't think they care. But they're certainly not going to allow NATO to bring the Ukraine into the NATO alliance. And the very fact that the Russians aren't removing troops from Russia, and that's what the United States is, through NATO, is screaming at, that the Russians must remove their troops from Russia as it borders the Ukraine.
They tolerate North Korean troops along the BMC, for how many decades,
Right.
They got Cubans right on the same island where they have a naval base, but they're going to make a big deal about Russian troops doing maneuvers on Russian soil.
Right. Americans do maneuvers all around the world with all manner of countries.
We still have troops in the Fulda Gap, for God's sake.
Yes. We almost launched a war against Syria over the Russian fleet. And we want to tell the Russians that they can't have 30,000 troops doing maneuvers in Russia, because it's close to the Ukraine and it gives the wrong signal. You know how many men the U.S. military has? And it's when you count the reservists, it's over 2 million.
I looked up a hypocrisy in their dictionary, and there was a picture of the White House and the Capitol.
Oh, of course. We in this particular case, everything that the United States is accusing Russia of, the United States is guilty of. And we ought to be celebrating the restraint that has been used here. Here's the United States having invaded two countries recently where over 1 million people died, and using its drones to invade other people's territory, killing 4,000 civilians. And here's America bombing Libya and turning it into a host country for Islamic jihadism. Here's America supplying the weapons in the Syrian proxy war that have led to a minimum of 150,000 deaths. And Russia with Crimea didn't fire a shot. Shouldn't we be celebrating that as the way for people to choose their own fate? No one was killed.
Well, it was a fraudulent referendum, don't you know? But it's just ridiculous. The Ukrainian coup government would have been better off with Klitschko in there, but he pulled out, and now they just have that criminal, that criminal Julia Tymoshenko, who got busted for lining her own pockets on a gas deal with Russia when she was in power.
Correct.
So she's already a criminal.
Correct.
And she's a Nazi, racist, fascist. She's a communist sensibilities, but she's using the fascists for her own muscle.
Correct. And so what you have is two coups in the Ukraine. They've had an experiment with independence for 20 years, and in 20 years they've had two coups, and the two most most acclaimed political leaders have both been accused. One has been imprisoned for graft, lining her own pockets, and she's the most popular in terms of the new regime. And then you have the one that they ousted, saying that he lined his pockets and that they're trying now for war crimes. They aren't capable of governing themselves. They don't have a legitimate government. It is mob rule amongst a group of people who are best known for their anti-Semitism and their viciousness.
And they propped up that tall, wimpy-looking, geeky guy as a Secretary of State type character to come over here and, try and say, Mr. Putin, tear down that wall. I mean, you got to be kidding me. He tried to be Reagan-esque. No way.
Of course. Glenn, have you ever heard of Bobby Yar?
No,
You're a really well-read individual. I had not heard of it either. I had a friend call me yesterday and said, why don't you Google Bobby Yar? Let me tell you a little bit about Bobby Yar so we know a little bit more about our Ukrainian dependence. Babi Yar is Russian. It is a ravine in the Ukraine capital of Kiev. Okay, so Babi Yar is a ravine in Kiev, the capital of the Ukraine. It is the site of a series of massacres that were carried out not just by the Nazis, but were collaborated in by the Ukrainians. The most notorious and best documented of these massacres took place in September 29th and 30th of 1941, where 33,771 Jews were killed in a single operation. The decision to kill them was by the military governor and was backed by the local police. The massacre was the largest single mass killing for which the Nazi regime and its collaborators, the collaborators in this case were Ukrainians, were responsible for during its campaign against the Soviet Union. Of course, the Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, was part of Tsarist Russia, part of that, and considered to be the largest single massacre in the history of the Holocaust, at least to that date. The massacre in Odessa of Jews was larger, but are you familiar with what country Odessa is found in?
I'm tempted to think the U.S. or Germany, but
no. Odessa is in the Ukraine as well.
Ukraine.
Yeah.
The city of Odessa. Oh, yeah.
Odessa, yeah, the city of Odessa. The largest two massacres of Jews took place in Kiev and Odessa. Now, let me share with you a little bit about the Babi Yar massacre, so we come to know our Ukrainian dependence better. The order reads, all Yids. Yid is the local term for Yahudim, for Jews. All Yids of the city of Kiev and its vicinity must appear on Monday, September 29th by 8 o'clock in the morning at the corner of Mechankova and Dorkstriva streets near the cemetery. Bring documents, money, and valuables, and also warm clothing, linen, etc. Any Yids who do not follow this order and are found elsewhere will be shot. Any civilians who enter the dwellings of the Yids, the Jews, and appropriate the things in them will be shot. On the 29th and 30th of September 1941, a special team of German SS troops, supported by other German units and local collaborators, murdered 33,771 Jewish civilians after taking them to the ravine. According to the testimony of one of the truck drivers, his name was Hofer, as they were delivering the victims to the ravine, they were first ordered to undress, completely naked, and were beaten if they resisted. He wrote, I watched what happened when the Jews, men, women, and children, were trucked to the ravine, trucked by Ukrainians. The Ukrainians led them past a number of different places where one after another they were forced to give up their luggage to the Ukrainians, their coats to the Ukrainians, their shoes and overgarments and also underwear to the Ukrainians. They were also had to leave their valuables in a designated place. There was a special pile for each article of clothing, monitored by the Ukrainians. It all happened very quickly, and if anyone who hesitated was kicked or pushed by the Ukrainians to keep them moving. Michael Brennenbaum, in his statement of a truck driver, Hofa, describing the murder of the Jews at Babi Yar, wrote, once undressed and naked, they were led to the ravine, which was about 150 meters long and 30 meters wide and a good 15 meters deep. When they reached the bottom of the ravine, they were seized and made to lie down on top of other Jews who had already been shot. Their corpses were stacked in layers. Police marksmen, these are not Germans now, these are Ukrainian policemen, came along and shot each Jew in the neck with a submachine gun. He said, I saw the Ukrainian marksmen stand on layers of corpses and shoot one after another. The gunman would walk across the bodies of the executed Jews to the next Jew, who had meanwhile lain down, and would shoot him. The money, the valuables, the underwear, and the clothing of the murdered victims were turned over by the Ukrainians to the Germans and to the Nazi administration of the city. Wounded victims were buried alive in the ravine along with the rest of their bodies. These are the Ukrainians. This is their first pogrom. Their first was prior to World War I. The second was during World War I. And they just continued the same behavior.
It's reminiscent of the one of the most horrific scenes from the movie Full Metal Jacket, where the Viet Cong instructed people of the one village to appear at a certain time, and they were professional. They were teachers, nurses, right, stuff like that. And it said anyone who showed up, got shot, and they showed all the bodies covered with lime and all that sort of thing. But we're only talking about a few dozen in that case, and that was sufficiently horrific to be sort of gut-wrenching in that one particular movie. And the numbers are far smaller.
Yeah, the My Lai incident in Vietnam was another example of the same thing, where we're dealing with 50, 70 individuals as opposed to 70,000 individuals, which is what happened at Odessa, or 40,000 individuals, which happened in Kiev. And, the Nazis, the Ukrainians weren't bothered by it. The Nazis were so bothered by it, their conscience was so stung by what they had done, that when the Soviets started to prevail against them and started to counterattack, the retreating Germans didn't want their malfeasance to be held against them. So what they did is they dug up all of at that point, I think there was around 100,000 bodies in these trenches. They dug them all up, and then they built enormous furnaces to cremate them. And for a period of a month, they systematically, every day, cremated these bodies and then hauled the ashes off and dumped them on the nearby farmland, making their ashes, if you will, fertilizer for the farmland to hide their malfeasance. The Ukrainians didn't have that conscience, only the Germans. It's an interesting story out of California. It is dominating the news in the Central Coast. I want to present it without being overly harsh, but it does require a bit of harshness. Perhaps you're aware of the story, Glenn, but a Christian religious pastor and his brother were performing baptisms, which is a religious ceremony in the surf on the California coast. And rather than being born anew into Christian eternity, the pastor's brother, who was assisting in the baptism, was swept off to sea and has disappeared. Since you could survive in that temperature water about 30 minutes. He's dead. If God wanted us to baptize people in the ocean, and he pulled this cool prank on this pastor and his brother of killing him for performing a baptism, that would be a really demented deity. But if God has nothing to do with baptism and is disgusted by the Christian religious ritual, then it is a real eye-opener for those who believe it holds some salvation significance.
Yeah,
it is a... Go ahead.
Well, generally speaking, it's baptism is still widely recognized. Christians will cite John the Baptist as baptizing people, unto repentance. So I don't know what your take on.
He actually didn't baptize anyone. What he did is immerse people in water. The Torah is filled with all sorts of references to the value of being cleansed by water. Water is a universal solvent, and removing sin, the filth of corruption from us, is a metaphor for what the set-apart Spirit does in our lives, to our souls. So the Torah constantly speaks of immersion in water, not baptism, but immersion in water, as a symbol for the outward cleaning that is a metaphor for the internal cleansing of our soul. And what Yahowah, the immerser, was doing was citing the prophets. He was literally citing from Yahowah, and so what he was doing had absolutely nothing to do with Christianity. It wasn't a baptism where you take the Babylonian pagan religion and you sprinkle water on top of someone's head. You immerse them in the Jordan, and in accordance with the Torah's teaching, and then cited Yahweh's prophetic testimony as it's recorded in Yahowah. God's testimony is something that Christians universally abhor, not only ignore, but actually dislike. So it puts him in an extraordinarily different position, and even his name means Yahweh is merciful. So when you change everything and you make him John the Baptist, and you make him a Christian symbol, then you pretty much ruined everything. Well, by the way, you know what was he saying? Didn't he say that he was a voice crying out in the wilderness, which means that he was among the few individuals who was willing to speak on behalf of Yahweh? That most people, through their religion or their politics in that community, had forgotten God, that they had no idea who he was, and so that he was uniquely out there declaring the message of Yahweh. So that's so different, the opposite of a religious message which is popular. And that the message he was conveying is make straight, clear the way, prepare the way of Yahweh. The way of Yahweh is the seven-step path that he has provided. You know, it begins with Passover matzah and Bakodim. And that's what he was saying, prepare the way of Yahweh, which is not the way of Christianity.
Right. But, well, in terms of baptism, I mean, the Christians are also fond of, you would have to, they would cite Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch from the book of Acts, saying that the early way, believers in Yahshua were baptizing even during the time of the book of Acts.
Yeah, but 80% of the book of Acts is Luke's testimony on behalf of Paul, who was demon-possessed and a wolf in sheep's clothing. We'll return after the break.